Okay, welcome back everyone to the second day of our conference on practical philosophy. Today we will have again two sessions and a keynote speaker. And our keynote speaker for today is Dr. Kathleen Creel. She is the Embedded Ethics Fellow at Stanford University, based in the Center for Ethics in Society and the Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence. Her research projects or interests are moral, political, and epistemic implications of machine learning as it is used in non-state automated decision-making and in science. And we would like to welcome you and thank you for joining us. I would also like to thank my colleagues who helped put together this conference, and also to the presenters who have sent us their work. Yesterday was really fulfilling and fun, and we hope today will be in the same veins as well. So without further ado, I leave the floor to Dr. Kathleen Creel, and her talk is entitled, The Algorithmic Leviathan. Really cool title, by the way. Arbitrariness, Fairness, and Opportunity. Thank you.
Thanks so much for the warm introduction. And I wanted to also say thank you to the organizers for creating this wonderful space where we junior researchers can get to know each other and share work. I think that has been so missing in the pandemic, and I'm just so grateful to them for their time and effort in putting this together. And thanks to Arzu, whose work I admire greatly, and hopefully she will be feeling better soon. So let me just share screen here. Okay, did that? No, that did not work. Sorry. Sorry, just one second. Okay, all good? Great. So this paper is based on joint work with Deborah Hellman at the University of Virginia, and I'm happy to be able to present to you the Algorithmic Leviathan. So when we think about the Hobbesian Leviathan, we think about this all-powerful ruler who has sort of domain over his entire nation state, and who, of course, in this wonderful image from the Leviathan's cover, whose body is made up of the body public, or all the different people in the realm whose authority sort of collectively supports the authority of the ruler. But importantly, his decisions kind of substitute for some of the decisions of the ruler, and this is part of the populace, and this is part of what makes the Hobbesian Leviathan so authoritative, but also so feared and so prone to misuse his power. And so I'm going to use the metaphor of the Leviathan to think about some issues in algorithmic governance, or governance by an algorithm that is substituting for some kind of human judgment. So when we think about the decision-making power of the Leviathan, we think about it as opaque, in the sense that the sovereign doesn't need to explain why he or she is doing something. It's opaque to the people why this decision is being made. It's systematic in that everyone in the territory is subject to this power equally. And oftentimes it's arbitrary, which is one of the things that makes the Hobbesian Leviathan bad, is that the use of power doesn't need to be predictable, rule-bound, or for a reason. It can just be the sort of arbitrary whim of the sovereign. And so automated decision-making in public life has some of these same features, it can be opaque, and there's been some work on trying to figure out in what way it's opaque. It can be systematic in that one algorithm can be used to replace many different human decision makers. And it can be arbitrary in the sense that the model that's making the decisions can rely on seemingly arbitrary correlations between pieces of data. So my thesis in this talk is going to be that arbitrariness in non-state algorithmic decision-making is problematic only when it's consistently applied at scale. So the goal here is try to think through and tease apart in a philosophical sense, what are the different possible sources of concern here, and which one really are underlying the problems that we see with automated decision-making. So imagine you are a hiring manager, and my case study is going to be this sort of search to do the initial cut for a job. So this is something that you might try to use automated decision-making for, but if we think about the original human features of the case, the hiring manager, let's say, has thousands of resumes, and we don't have time to interview all those people. So out of that giant stack of resumes, we want to find only a few, let's say 3 to interview and 1 to hire. And so this problem has a bunch of constraints in the sense that time is not infinite. So we have time constraints. We have information constraints. We don't know everything about all the candidates. There might be something about them that we don't know that could turn out to be really relevant, but we only have the information in the files. There are privacy constraints. In a lot of countries, there are things that we can't know about the candidates. And the feature space is underdefined, which is sort of a machine learning technical way of saying something very simple, which is that we don't actually know what are the features, what are the things about the candidates that actually conduce to their being a good employee. It might be that we have kind of our own list, either mental or hopefully written down somewhere in a more formalized way of what we think will make a candidate good at the job. But even if all those features are good, it could also be true that there are other things that make people good at this job that we haven't thought to formalize. And so we know that there are sort of known unknowns. We know that there are things about this decision that we don't fully understand. So there have been a bunch of companies that have sort of stepped into this space and said, okay, we can help you with this screening problem. We can come up with some kind of automated decision-making system that will go through resumes for you and that will give you a short list of candidates. And so these often rely on scanning the resume itself. Sometimes they rely on more sort of questionable or pseudoscientific things like having candidates play, cognitive games to see how their response times are, or having them do a video interview and then sort of trying to analyze the video itself. And the promise that a lot of these companies make is that this is going to increase diversity and mitigate bias. So the idea there is that hiring is known to be a very sort of biased endeavor. People often pick people who are more like them or who they have some kind of social connection to. And so maybe by using a computer to do it, we can sort of eliminate some of this bias and give everyone a more fair consideration. But importantly, whether or not it eliminates bias, having an automated decision-making system standardizes the decision. So we move from having a bunch of different hiring managers, each of whom have their own criteria, their own slightly different ways of evaluating candidates, their own things that they're looking for. We sort of standardize that and have a more consistent criteria for identifying candidates. But that also means whatever mistakes our new algorithmic system is making are going to be amplified. So the point here is that automated decision-making systems standardize by enforcing the same classifications on every token applicant file every time it's encountered at scale. So an automated decision-making system doesn't necessarily know people as people per se, but every time it encounters the same file, it would give the same judgment about whether this person should move on to the shortlist. So we have this question: is this standardization a problem? So if the same company is now making an algorithm that is used by 700 big companies, potentially even more, is that kind of standardizing effect in itself a problem? So before we get there, let's think a little bit about this, the other side of this coin. So we're standardizing the decision, but what are the features that the decision that's being standardized is made on? So one thing that is always a problem whenever we're thinking about algorithmic decision-making or decision-making made by a machine is there arbitrariness that's underlying the decision? So if you were looking at a resume and you were trying to decide what about this resume is important in terms of figuring out whether to hire this candidate, let's say there's a correlation between a certain feature of a resume and a rejection of a candidate. So there have been a couple high-profile cases in the US about companies that tried to use automated decision-making systems to do this very thing, to screen resumes, and found that they were biased in certain ways. So for example, having a name that is most often used by female people, like Kathleen, would lead to a candidate being more likely to be rejected. So if you asked the system, which parts of this resume were salient in sort of you deciding to reject this candidate, which parts were important, it would highlight just the name itself. And you might think, well, you shouldn't be rejecting people just based on their name. You should be accepting or rejecting them based on actual features of their resume. So a correlation between a name and a rejection, that seems like a pretty simple case of bias. But what about arbitrariness? So what about if the system said, well, just the fact that the fifth line of your CV was a certain length long, or the fact that you double majored, these things are kind of arbitrary. They're not correlated with any kind of historical discrimination. They're just like weird features of your CV that to us read as being a reason to reject the candidacy. So one way to think about why this might happen is this phenomenon in machine learning known as overfitting. So imagine you have a decision space. You have a problem, which is that you're trying to pick all the blue dots, which are mostly on the right side of the screen, as being good candidates, and you're trying to pick all the red dots as being bad candidates. So you know that the good candidates and the bad candidates, there's, in any particular group of people you look at, there's always going to be some noise. So there's always going to be some outliers where a red dot is going to sort of be in the space of features that is mostly full of blue dots, which less metaphorically means, someone who on paper didn't seem like a great candidate based on the things that you know to look for actually did turn out to be great. But that might be something that, even if that's true, you might not know how to make a rule or an algorithm to look for that in the future. So one thing we want to do in machine learning is try to find what's the rule, the algorithm, that will generalize, that will give us a good performance on new data and not sort of learn too much or overfit on the data that we have now. So in this picture, the rule we want to learn is the black line. It doesn't get everything perfectly, but we think that it'll generalize better the next time we do this task. Whereas if we learn the green line, if we really perfectly tried to capture every single point of data that we have about all these candidates, the next time we do this task, we're going to get some really weird results because we've learned, in some sense, too much. So a good example of this is sometimes machine learning is used in trying to diagnose diseases from x-rays. So here's a scan of pneumonia in a lung x-ray, and what you would want would be for your system to just sort of look at the image itself and learn things based on the features of the image. But it turned out in a study that got a lot of press that there had been two kinds of x-ray images. One was taken in the hospital with the stationary x-ray machine, and one was taken in the ambulance with the portable x-ray machine, this little handheld thing on the left. And it turned out that all of the portable x-rays were stamped with the word portable on the top. And so instead of learning a pattern that had to do with the actual features of the lungs, the machine learning algorithm learned to recognize the word portable. So why would that be? Well, it turns out that people with pneumonia who are sicker are more likely to be taken to the hospital in an ambulance. And so it is correlated, this feature of having pneumonia and having a scan that has the word portable, because if you're in the ambulance, you're more likely to have pneumonia. But that's not actually something that's about the underlying image itself. And so you might worry, now if I move my algorithm to a hospital that doesn't have the same kind of portable x-ray machine, I'll realize that I didn't actually learn the right things about how to identify pneumonia. So this kind of overfitting can lead to these arbitrary correlations between features of the data, like the word pneumonia, or just weird little features of the resume, and the final decision. Okay, so we've talked about arbitrariness and standardization, and now we're going to get into some of the ethics part. So does this kind of arbitrariness wrong individuals? Does it wrong individuals at scale? And who are the people who are likely to be arbitrarily excluded? So do arbitrary decisions wrong individuals? So first we have this question, what kind of arbitrariness presents a moral problem? So I was a little bit loose in the last section in terms of trying to describe arbitrariness, but now let's tighten up a little bit on what kind of arbitrariness we're talking about. So one type of arbitrariness you might think of as unpredictability. So maybe we just can't predict your decision, and so it feels arbitrary from our perspective. And this seems like not the moral problem, in that hiring managers in the human case might permissibly choose to change their own goals. In that, let's say you're doing a hire and you realize halfway through, oh wow, actually I needed this, not that. You're allowed to change your own objectives, and so appear as unpredictable to other people. Let's try arbitrariness interpreted as a lack of constraint by the rules. Well, if we're thinking about algorithmic decision-making, that's not going to be the problem for us, right? Because even pseudo-random algorithms are still based on rules. They're still, the whole point is that we're trying to figure out a set of implicit rules as encoded in this algorithm that will govern when I see X, I do Y. So they're still fundamentally rule-based. But I think the more promising way to think about arbitrariness in this case is as lack of a good reason. And if that's the case, we have to think about what would the reason be. So when we're thinking about these kinds of ethical political decisions, we often think about demandingness. So how high is the standard of demand on the kind of reason that's presented? So the kind of most demanding would be that the reason provided has to be public oriented. So let's say instead of hiring, now we're thinking about lending. So you go to the bank and you apply for a loan to start a small business or buy a house or something like that. And so one, perhaps the most compelling case here would be the public-oriented reason. Yes, you didn't get the loan, we rejected your application, but it's because of it. Everyone with your qualifications, there would be so many defaults on loans that the housing market would collapse, and that would be bad for everyone. So it's too demanding to require that every action taken by companies in hiring and lending be justified by a public-oriented reason. There are some things that companies do that are due to their own interests, and that seems like it's okay. So maybe the reason provided has to be good for the person affected. If we gave you this loan, you would likely default, and that would ultimately not be good for you. You would have ruined your credit and set back your ability to attain the kind of financial stability that you seek. So this also seems like probably too demanding to require that private employers and lenders always act for the benefit of the applicants. They are hiring because they have a certain need, and it would be too difficult for them to weigh out of all the applicants, each of whom would benefit from having this job, for whom it would be the most good or something like that. So we end up with the idea that the reason provided must be good for the actor or for the decision maker. And here it still seems too demanding to morally require that agents act in their own interest. So it might be irrational for people to fail to act in their own interest, but they don't owe it to the applicants to act in their own interest. They might owe it to themselves, but that's not a way in which they've sort of harmed the applicants if they fail to serve their interests as well as they could. So after unpacking what arbitrariness might mean, we're left with this demand that the actor pursue her own goals in a manner that's sort of best suited to their attainment. But why think that people affected are entitled to this? So the first conclusion here is that individuals are not entitled to non-arbitrary decisions unless, of course, some other right guarantees it. So if you're in a space and if in your country or whatever, there are certain rules that govern hiring or lending, like strictures on bias, as long as you've satisfied those, you're not entitled to non-arbitrary decisions. But then we have this separate question: do arbitrary decisions at scale wrong individuals? Is that a separate issue? So here I'm going to lean a little bit on some egalitarian philosophers like Elizabeth Anderson. So her theory is that individual companies acceptably might establish hierarchies or rankings, and this applies to hiring too. So they might say, hey, out of all these candidates, these ones are the best, these ones are the worst from our perspective. But importantly, the same hierarchy ought not to consistently dominate. Because if the same hierarchy is used within an entire sector or a geographic territory, if every single company evaluated every single applicant in exactly the same hierarchy, it can sort of set the rules of interaction within a domain and monopolize access to opportunities. So people who are evaluated by this hierarchy as being worse might have no shot at an opportunity, no hiring manager who sort of looks at them and says, hey, you know, I see something, like, let's give you a chance. And this kind of exclusion of the same people over and over can lead to social hierarchy. And this kind of exclusion we can think of as a threshold harm to autonomy. So if we think about autonomy as involving access to a sufficient range of varied alternatives, then it's not a moral harm to be denied one alternative or one opportunity, like one job or one loan. But this kind of harm of exclusion is of greater moral importance when it's at scale. So, okay, sure, you get denied from one job, that's unfortunate, but as long as you have a sufficient range of varied alternatives such that you can make a genuine choice, you still have the autonomy to sort of make choices that reflect how your life goes, and be the author of your own life path. And so it becomes a threshold harm to autonomy to be shut out of a significant number of possible alternatives. And these kind of monopolies on opportunity constrain autonomy in a morally troubling way. So when a significant limit on opportunity lacks even instrumental rationality, so when we can't even say, oh, well, you did this because it was in your best interests, when it's truly arbitrary, I'm going to argue that it's morally unjustified. So the second conclusion here is that arbitrariness, this kind of arbitrary correlations that we talked about earlier, are only of moral concern when arbitrary judgments about the same people are uniformly enforced at scale. So when it becomes this uniform judgment that then sort of controls or structures access to opportunities more broadly. So when is this likely to happen? When is arbitrariness likely to be scaled up? So the most obvious example would be the one that I alluded to at the beginning, which is to some extent happening, which is that the same algorithm made by the same company is used across a wide sector. And it wouldn't be too hard for this to happen in a lot of places. If, let's say, you live in a town and there aren't that many employers in the kind of work that you're trained for, if all those employers happen to use the same algorithm, it might be the case that they would all come to the same judgment about you, even though, let's say, a different algorithm or a hiring manager in a different city might have a different judgment. So even if the company pays extra to have the algorithm customized, as sometimes happened, the same trained model is still the starting point. And this kind of standardization is likely, even if it's not literally the same algorithm used across the scale. So if you can imagine being trained on the same data set, so the same original input data that you're learning from, if a bunch of different algorithms are learning from the same data, they're going to have similar patterns of knowledge. And so they're going to learn similar things that are good, but they're also going to learn similar arbitrary correlations and artifacts. And especially they're going to learn the same false negatives, so the same sort of failures to identify someone as a good candidate. So you can imagine this might happen in a hiring data set. Let's say if you have some kind of unusual feature, or you happen to share something in common with people in the original data set who just completely coincidentally happen to be terrible employees, right? So you went to the same university as them, or you have the same unusual skill that they do. So the algorithm might look at that and say, hey, the three people for whom this was true in the original data set, they were all bad employees, so this new person probably is too. But it turns out that's just sort of an arbitrary correlation between the fact that they had the skill and they were bad employees. There wasn't any kind of causal link. And so even though you are a great employee, you're being painted with the same brush. And so this is especially a problem if the same publicly available data is used by everyone. So if everyone is relying on the same information, they're more likely to have these correlations appear that are the same. So this is common in the US when people use credit reports, which is sort of this history of your past financial transactions, and people might use that to make lending decisions. So let's take an example of how this kind of thing might happen just based on looking at the same data set. So there's this famous database of images called ImageNet. So it has a whole bunch of pictures, it has 22,000 categories, 14 million images, and each of the images is labeled. So these images on the right are labeled as stingray. And so people have gone through and labeled them with what their main contents are. And a lot of people use this image database to train their own image recognition algorithms. And especially because there's this challenge, which is an even smaller database and an even smaller number of categories. And this challenge is sort of what you get a lot of credit for having won every year. So people who are coming up with new image recognizers want to win this challenge, and so they're incentivized to train on the data set. And so it's been known for a long time that the human faces in ImageNet are not evenly distributed. So out of the people represented, males, light-skinned people, and adults between the age of 18 and 40 are overrepresented. And so different people who are not in these categories are not going to have their faces recognized as well. So ImageNet is not good at recognizing children, not good at recognizing older people, not good at recognizing darker skinned people, less good at recognizing women than men, etc. So those biases are known, but it's also interesting that ImageNet is also biased in sort of a more neutral sense towards textures. And this can create arbitrary classifications. So I'll just show you this image a little closer up. So in ImageNet, there's these pictures like fox squirrel or dragonfly. So this picture on the left is supposed to be a squirrel, and this picture on the right is supposed to be a dragonfly. But classifiers that are trained on ImageNet almost always misidentify this image on the left as a sea lion and this image on the right as a manhole cover. And the reason that happens is that the texture of these images is very strong. So there's this rock in the squirrel image that has this strong texture that looks a lot like a sea lion, kind of this watery, wet, dark texture. And on the right, this cross-hatched texture of the chair that the dragonfly is on looks a lot like this sort of cross-hatched texture of the manhole cover. And so the algorithm ends up ignoring what's in the foreground and just identifying it based on this texture. And so this kind of bias towards texture is one that causes this arbitrary correlation, where even though there's no sea lion or no manhole cover in the original image, it's going to be consistently identified as being a sea lion or a manhole cover. And so you can imagine if all of the classifiers that are trained on this one database, ImageNet, make this same sort of texture-based set of mistakes, something similar can happen in the resume screening or the lending cases, you know, where we're dealing with data that's about people, where some background feature emerges as seeming really important to the classifier that maybe isn't so important. So arbitrary features of a candidate's file that wouldn't stand out to a human reader might be correlated in the original training data with predictive power. So it might be useful to learn these. But this kind of overfitting to the original training data causes arbitrariness. And when we share that training data across models, it systematizes the arbitrariness. So this is exactly the sort of point that we want to be thinking about for what the moral issue here, which is when do we have arbitrariness that's then systematized at scale? What are the moral issues with that? So if we have this moral problem, who is likely to be harmed by these systematic arbitrary correlations, or who is the algorithmic Job? So the first thing to say is that it could be anyone. These arbitrary features that are correlated with the sort of bad employees in the original limited training data. So in the way we talked about earlier, if you have this unusual skill, that might make you correlated with other bad employees, even though you were a great employee. And these kind of groups that are thus created might not be groups in the traditional sense. They might not be, you know, oh, we're all people who do this job or people who have this skill. They might have very little in common beyond being the people who are consistently re-identified by the algorithm and put in this category. And this kind of creation of arbitrary groups is especially likely if we're using something like video interview data, where there's so much information, you know, the video itself has so much extra information that's not about what the candidate is saying, that it's more likely that some kind of arbitrary feature could emerge. So it's also possible that it might not be an arbitrary group. It's possible that systemic arbitrariness might have an impact on a group that's already discriminated against for some reason. So in this case, we're going to bracket this as saying, then we already have a good analysis of why that's a moral problem, which is that it's discriminatory. And so this is a separate concern from the arbitrariness. But they could overlap in interesting ways. So if you think about all of the information that the algorithm has to learn from, so these hundreds or potentially thousands of features or things that it knows about candidates, we can think about that as a multidimensional space where each of the possible categories of ways to describe someone is a dimension. And so if we have these large data sets, we have potentially thousands of features that we're learning from and considering. And the algorithm creates kind of a multidimensional shape where these different features contribute to being a better or worse candidate. And one of the tricky things about finding problems with algorithmic decision-making is that it's very difficult to audit this multidimensional space for this kind of arbitrary bias against individuals or tiny subgroups. So imagine again, we're in this high dimensional space, which I'm just using this three-dimensional image for obvious reasons. So let's say again, the blue dots, which are mostly on the right and the upper part of the shape, let's say the blue dots are good candidates, and for the most part, they are being identified as good. They're in this higher part of the feature space, but there are a couple blue dots, as you can see near the arrow, that are kind of marooned in these wells of algorithmic feature space where they're being put along with the red dots. And so we're misidentifying them as being especially bad candidates, even though they're actually quite good. So in the US, there are these federally protected categories on which you're not allowed to discriminate. So race, religion, national origin, age, sex, disability status, and veteran status. And so we have some pretty good tools for checking whether that kind of discrimination is happening. So if I give the classifier two people who have exactly the same resume, but I change one of these features, I make them, let's say, older or younger, does the judgment change? That can give me a pretty good hint about whether this feature is being used in a discriminatory way within the classifier. But there's this issue that you just saw in the last slide, which is sometimes it might be the case that even though we're not discriminating on the basis of just one of those categories, we're discriminating on the basis of more than one. Some kind of subgroup, as the machine learning people call it, or intersectional category within these axes of existing discrimination. And so if we only audit for single axis discrimination, we're going to miss it. And legal standards don't require audits for multi-axis discrimination. So a descriptive point here is that any individual could be the one arbitrarily excluded by the algorithmic Leviathan, but groups could also be subgroups of protected categories, and we wouldn't know. It would be really hard to find them using our existing techniques. So what do we do about this? So I think it's important when we can to try to propose some kind of solution. Otherwise, you know, the machine learning people that we're working with say, oh my gosh, you identified this problem, now what are we going to do about it? So one thing we can do is try to fight arbitrariness with randomness. And this is a sort of traditional way to try to get out of these arbitrary correlations by introducing some randomness. So here what we can do is we can train not just one model on one set of data, but we can train multiple models of different kinds, or we can train the same model on different subsets of our data. And our goal here is to make these models as different as possible in their outcomes while still having a good threshold of performance. So we're trying to sort of recapture the state we had originally where different human hiring managers might all be good at their jobs, might all be good at finding good candidates, but they might pick slightly different people. And so we want to recapture that by having these different models that each kind of look for different things. And this is something called predictive multiplicity. So this is often something that machine learning people worry about. They're like, hey, wait a second, why is it that if we train different models, we get slightly different answers? We want to be able to somehow learn from that and create one best supermodel. But in this case, we actually don't want to do that. We don't want to create, again, this one algorithmic Leviathan from our different models. We want to take advantage of that multiplicity and assign each of these models to different companies so that we can still have some difference in who gets hired. And so we can either choose randomly among the model predictions, or we can choose with kind of a weighted average to take advantage of the fact that some are slightly better than others. And this kind of stochasticity can preserve the possibility of being classified otherwise. So if we have this randomness, we're choosing randomly between the models, then even if the same algorithm is being used at different companies, if you, a single applicant, apply to all these different companies, there's some possibility that at one of them, you're going to get the model that thinks you're really good. So one note is that in cases of multiplicity, it might be the case that, in fact, one model just perfectly predicts or perfectly identifies all the causal factors. And if we knew which one that was, sure, maybe we should do it. But in these real life cases, we don't actually know. So until we have some better access to that, it's better to preserve the randomness, because then at least we're not choosing one of the models that is worse. So how might this work? Well, we have 100 candidates. Our first model, Model A, out of the 10 people who are actually qualified, gets 9 of them but rejects Alice. But then our second model, Model B, still gets 9 candidates but rejects a different person, Juan, let's say. And so in each of these cases, Alice and Juan still have a chance to be accepted instead of being arbitrarily rejected. So this kind of preserves our base level of performance from the point of view of the company, but there's also some sense in which the performance it sacrifices might be arbitrary. So it might be that we don't completely know what it is to be a good employee, and so having some randomness might preserve our ability to learn. All right, so thank you very much for listening to my talk, and I look forward to your questions and to hearing the rest of your talks.
Thank you very much. That was really informative, and I certainly enjoyed it a lot. So the floor is now open for any questions and comments. and I'll look at the list. You may raise your hand or you may write in the chat, and I'll ask as I see hands. Okay, I think I first saw Matthew's hand. So Matthew, you may go ahead.
Great, okay. Thanks so much for your talk. Love the Golden Gate Bridge behind you. It's my hometown. So. But you were, if I understood you right, you said that one problem with arbitrariness was that it, at a wide enough scale, iterated over and over again, it could generate a kind of social hierarchy, right? But that seems to me to be a kind of self-correcting problem, because if there's a social hierarchy, at least it's not arbitrary. And there might be other problems with the social hierarchy, but at least one knows what one has to do to get in. One just has to be part of the special group. And if you're not part of the group, then you can plan something else. And so I was wondering what you thought about maybe another grounds for objecting to arbitrariness, which could be that it makes future-directed planning very difficult, chancy, and leads to a lot of wasted time and valuable resources. And so basically what an arbitrary job market or other kind of institutional structure does is it kind of compromises our ability to plan, execute plans, and since we care about our futures, that's a source of value for us. It leads to a lot of compromises in that direction. So I just want to know what you thought about that.
Yeah, definitely. Great question. So I think I would say that the two parts of your question are very related, at least in the way that I was understanding hierarchy. So it's not the case that this is sort of by social hierarchy, I didn't mean, you know, like a clique or a group or sort of a social setting. I meant more that if the same people are getting rejected from, you know, at the extreme case, which wouldn't happen, but like all jobs, then you can imagine that they're also not able to access other sort of like social goods or other ways to participate in society. And so they're being sort of excluded from these kind of standard ways to participate in social life writ broadly. And so there's this sort of hierarchy in which like goods and status are given to the people who are rewarded by the algorithm, and, you know, not to the people who are consistently rejected by it. But I think you're right that one of the interesting features about this algorithmic case is that at least we're positing the possibility that, you know, a lot of people for this particular company, let's say we're hiring for, you know, Philosophy Corp, whatever it is that Philosophy Corp does. So Philosophy Corp has candidates who are genuinely great at the job, and most of them get hired. But then there's just like a couple people who get kind of arbitrarily rejected from that. I agree with you. Part of the issue with the fact that it's an arbitrary rejection is that they have no way to sort of plan, how do I become a better candidate from the point of view of the algorithm? Because normally, if you're being rejected for reasons that have to do with your job performance, you can say, hey, my incentives in terms of what I need to change and the employer's incentives in terms of what they want me to change are pretty aligned, you know, in the sense that if I become a genuinely better candidate for this job, I'm more likely to be hired, and both of us are happier. Whereas if you don't know what the arbitrary feature is, it's really hard to change, you know, this facet of your CV, or, you know, the fact that you said that you had the skill or whatever random thing it is. So yeah, I agree with you. There's part of the issue with this, the fact that it's arbitrariness at scale and not just correctness at scale or whatever, is that there's this lack of alignment in terms of your planning capacity. So thank you for the question. That was a great point.
Thank you. Next we have Hussein. I think I saw another hand by Mr. Kurtulmuş. So if you have a question, please do raise your hand and I'll give the next question to you. So Hussein, you may go ahead.
I think my question might be leaning on some misunderstanding of your presentation, but let me just ask it as a clarificatory question. Towards the beginning of your presentation, did you say that we do not owe non-arbitrariness to individual victims of non-arbitrary practice? If you were, I thought you were defending this idea that we do not owe non-arbitrariness to individual victims. If this was the case, I did not totally understand how you were trying to solve the problem of involving these individuals in non-arbitrary practices, who are victims of arbitrary practice into non-arbitrary realm, in a sense.
Okay, great. So tell me if this addresses the question. Yeah, good. So let's say we're thinking about the human case. The difference I was trying to draw out, and thanks for the opportunity to clarify, is that if we're thinking about just sort of like one interaction, let's again take the human case and think about like, I'm a hiring manager, you know, I have 10 qualified candidates, but I can only hire 5, let's say. It's probably okay that out of those 10, the 5 I end up picking up are kind of for arbitrary reasons. They're all qualified, they all could do the job. Maybe I pick the ones that I interview after lunch because I'm in a more cheerful mood, who knows? But as long as the candidates really are qualified, that seems probably okay. Whereas if that same, part of what makes that potentially okay is that for the candidates, it's not a one-shot deal. They then have the opportunity to apply to other jobs, which might have different arbitrary screening mechanisms. And so in some sense, they can roll the dice over and over until it works. Whereas if it's the same arbitrariness at a big scale, then they don't have the opportunity to roll the dice more than once. And so that arbitrariness is going to control their life outcomes more than it would if everyone had a different set of arbitrary criteria.
Okay, great. So does this mean that on a practical level, if I mean, unless many or similar companies are using similar softwares, we don't have this problem, right? So this problem arises on the practical level mostly, right?
Yeah, so this problem only arises on the practical level if everyone is using similar software, or if everyone's different software is trained on the same data so that it might behave the same.
Thank you.
Awesome, thank you.
All right, next we have Fausto Corvino.
Yes. Thank you very much for your beautiful presentation. And actually, while you were talking, I was thinking, I was making some personal consideration. I was thinking, if tomorrow I have to make a job application, would I prefer to be selected, but to be evaluated by an algorithm or by human beings? So I start writing down the pros and cons of the both things. But then I reached the conclusion that actually it really depends on the context. Because, for example, I was thinking, if I were to make a job application in Italy, where the perception of phenomena like corruption, clientelism, favoritism is very high. I'm not saying that is true, but at least it's my perception, also the perception of other people. I reached the conclusion I would really prefer to be evaluated by an algorithm rather than by a human being, because the risk is much lower. The risk of this unjust discrimination are much lower. So I was thinking, if really, in your opinion, algorithm can help, especially in contexts where there are a lot of market distortion, like, for example, in Italy or in other countries. And then I also was thinking about something else, that I was imagining, for example, that I made a job application and I really feel that I deserve the job. So this is my personal feeling, but still I don't get the job. And I feel that I've been discriminated, I've been by a human being unjustly. So I have the sensation that I've been harmed some way, either voluntary or involuntary, by human being, and I feel angry about it and I feel bad about it. So I suffer loss of well-being for this. Whereas if I feel like I've been unjustly rejected by an algorithm, I can accept it like a matter of brute luck, and so I don't feel bad about it. So I was thinking I would prefer to be discriminated unjustly, in my view, at least from my perception, by an algorithm than by a human being. Do you think it also plays an ethical role?
Yeah, great question. Good. So I really, yeah, so speaking to your 2 points, I think your first point is just so important and something that often gets left out of these considerations, which is, you know, if we're thinking about what's the ethical consideration for the introduction of an algorithm or some sort of algorithmic decision making, we have to think about what's the background context. You know, what's the overall social, as you were saying, what's the overall social environment into which, and political environment into which the algorithm is being introduced, what's it replacing, and instead of considering it in the abstract, considering it in comparison to what our other alternatives are. So Amanda Askell makes a version of this point, and I think you really targeted it well for this setting, which is like, we can't just consider this in the abstract. And then on the second point, I think that's really interesting, and I hadn't thought about the sort of affective considerations of how people might feel differently about being accepted or rejected in each of these cases. There's an interesting book called How Humans Judge Machines that tries to do some kind of like social science and investigate how do humans feel, as you were saying, about these kind of different algorithmic decision-making outcomes. And so that might be one place to look. But yeah, thanks for bringing up those points.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Next, we have Philip Schwartz. You may go ahead.
Yes. Also, I'd like to thank you. And Fausto's question got me thinking about the place of accountability in your picture, because I'm thinking if I get rejected by a human resources manager and I can justifiably suspect that I was discriminated against, which in my case might be not that likely, but anyways, I could try to take the case to court and so on, or maybe even if I don't get to do this, I might have a goal for my resentment and frustration. But whom do I get to sue if I suspect that the algorithm is discriminating against me?
Yeah, great point. Good. So yeah, I think this is a really interesting point. So there's this question of recourse. As you're saying, you know, who is it that I go to if I'm being discriminated against? Is it the original makers of the algorithm? Is it the company that purchased the algorithmic system and is now using it? Who's sort of responsible? I think the EU is a little further along, certainly than the US, in trying to sort out these questions and figure out, because in a lot of cases it might be that legally the company is responsible for their own hiring decisions, but they might not be the people who have the sort of expertise or access to the inside of the black box software to be able to actually do the kind of auditing that you would need. And so what I'm hoping we would do is move more towards this kind of like standardized third-party audits where, you know, if this kind of situation arises, the company has to turn over their software, even if they're a third party, for this kind of testing and this kind of comparative analysis of, you know, your resume, the person who's being discriminated against, and, you know, other sort of similar resumes that have slightly different features to see, does that make a difference? But yeah, I mean, the legal structures are not there. Morally, I think it is the kind of thing that since we have in place, as you said, for a human, we ought to also have in place for any kind of algorithmic decision making, and there has to be a way to do this, but the laws have to catch up.
I don't see any more questions right now. We have about a couple more minutes, so maybe if you would like to elaborate with a few sentences where this project is going next, because I think I saw in your slide there was one page which mentioned what's next for the project, so maybe you would like to elaborate on that, and then we can end our session.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for the opportunity to do that, and thanks again for your questions. I found them really illuminating, and I will definitely think more about them. So what's next for this project, and I would please feel free to email me. I'll put my email in the chat after. I would love to hear your thoughts on any of this. This kind of arbitrariness in machine learning is not by any means limited to hiring or lending, and so I want to think about how these kind of arbitrary features might play out in scientific machine learning. So if we're trying to do machine learning on a large mass of scientific data, how might this affect the kind of novelties that arise that might make us think, oh, maybe our theory is wrong, maybe we need to re-examine the theory. How do we distinguish true novelty from these kind of arbitrary features? And then, in this talk, I sort of tried to constrain the domain a little bit by just thinking about non-state decision-making. But I think the landscape actually changes quite a bit if you're thinking about a government or a state that has far more responsibilities to the people in the state. And so if, as is happening somewhere, if a government is doing this kind of algorithmic decision-making, presumably there's a much higher standard in terms of not being arbitrary. And so how do we use some political theory to back that up? On the sort of standardization side, I'm interested in this question that sort of piggybacks off that last point about the different possible models that all are modeling the same topic. So is this kind of pluralism something that could be useful for modeling and balancing how competing values and competing ways of thinking about a problem could all be present in a democracy and could all be present as part of a pluralistic state of some kind? And then also on the standardization side, there have been some calls recently to sort of use these kind of methods to go through grant proposals. As I'm sure won't surprise a lot of people in this room, this virtual room, people don't like reading grants. They find it very boring. And so just as you can use it to screen hiring resumes, you can also use it to screen grants. But what happens to the epistemic diversity of scientific research communities when the same algorithm is used to sort grant proposals? So those are kind of some of the places I want to go with each of the wings of this project. And this paper is archived. It's not yet published, but if you want to read it and tell me your hard-hitting criticisms, please do. I still have opportunities to change it and make it better. So yeah, thanks again to the organizers. This was a lot of fun.